So welcome back to Study Chess with me. And in this video, we're going to be moving on from tactics to positional play, more specifically studying the works of Ludek Pachman, The Complete Chess Strategy, a 3-volume edition expanded upon the 1-volume well-known book by Dover called Modern Chess Strategy. Now, The Complete Chess Strategy, at least in English, has no longer been printed for quite a number of years. In fact, the only editions you can find, or at least that I've found, are those by Batsford in descriptive chess notation, which is a colossal pain in the neck. Nevertheless, I've also acquired these editions in French, which thankfully is in algebraic, and have prepared this so that you can follow these works with me. The first volume is done on piece play, and it covers basically all of the strategic niceties and essentials of bishops, rooks, queens in the middle game, and whatnot. And then finally, of course, we have the second volume, which is concentrated on pawn structures, which is where we're at right now. We'll be going on to the last game of the chapter of passed pawns, and more specifically, blockading those passed pawns. And then we'll be moving on to the chapter on isolated pawns. Now, if you're late to the series or this work, then please look up the previous videos in the series in which I've covered the earlier chapters. Chapter 4 is isolated pawns. And that being said, let's get on with it. So this is the first game of our study session in the second volume of Complete Chess Strategy by Ludek Pachman. This is the chapter, the last game covering passed pawns, or more specifically, blockading special kinds of passed pawns. After this game, we'll be going to the chapter on isolated pawns. If you would like to review the entire chapter on passed pawns, then just look up the previous videos on Study Chess with me and you will be able to catch up just fine. I do a similar study session as here, going over the games, giving you my comments as I study them for myself, because I'm a firm believer in not just mindlessly droning through the moves and going, oh, wow, but trying to take a more proactive approach to the experience and asking myself questions. What do I think of the move? What do I think of? Is there an idea that comes to my mind? What do I think of the tactics? Does he make a line? Is there something that sticks out that doesn't make sense? It's not a question of me believing that I have something more valuable to say than the grandmaster who wrote the book. But you have to be inquisitive. You have to ask questions. You have to be willing to have that, curiosity to be able to move forward, because these are the questions that you ask yourself that need to be answered, so that when you actually are presented with a similar position or position that has characteristics that remind you of this, you'll be able to deal with these with a certain confidence, not just like, this is what the grandmaster said, but this is what I thought also. This is what I learned from the process. Anyway, so this game is by Gligoric and Szabo. Gligoric was a very famous Yugoslavian player in the 50s and 60s. He was playing in the group of players of Spassky, Bronstein, even Botvinnik, although Botvinnik wasn't really so active anymore in the tournament circuit then. And Bobby Fischer, absolutely, although not in 1952, of course. And Szabo was also a prominent Hungarian player of the 50s and 60s, although not quite as strong as Gligoric, although Szabo is going to grab the upper hand here. This was played at the Helsinki Olympiad in 1952, and it was played between, of course, the two countries. So let's see what we have here. So this is a king's... No, this is not a king's Indian. What is this? This is a Nimzo Indian Rubinstein, c5. Okay. It has a reputation for being very drawish, today at least, but very solid. So if there's one opening that hasn't, let's just say, been overruled by more modern developments, this is one of them. Five, okay, that's not typical of it, but it's certainly a possibility. There are lots of lines that play this way. B4, B6. There are lines of the Caro-Kann Panov attack, which sometimes has people playing c5 and then pushing this way. G3, so here he played d takes c5 with the pawn on the queen. However, Pachman does point out that b takes c5 would have been a mistake simply because black continues with knight c6 and he's doing very well. So d takes c5, a5, exclamation point, and of course immediately attacking that potentially very dangerous pawn phalanx on the queen side. If you let them run, they will do so happily. Let's see what the book says. So he points out, this seemingly illogical move, since it allows white to obtain two fairly advanced connected passed pawns. After all, you're moving the pawn to a5, therefore b5 is possible. You'll have the b and c pawns readily available. I'll show this right here. Maybe not red. Let's see what I have. Oh, yellow looks better. So these two pawns now will have free rein to move forward. Well, free rein meaning there won't be a pawn preventing their advance. However, it is soon clear that these pawns are not as dangerous as they look, for it is precisely their advanced position which makes a blockade easier to achieve. Okay? So rook b1, and he does add the comment that bishop b2 would have been worse because of knight c6, attacking that b pawn twice, b5, knight e5. And suddenly those pawns are looking kind of vulnerable because it's very difficult to back them up. The c5 pawn, of course, is being attacked. And if you advance it, it's going to be problematic. First of all, you can't advance it. I am completely crazy. Because black is threatening mate here. Yeah. Sorry. I was a little too enthusiastic about looking at that c pawn. So yeah, with the threat of mate here, then the c pawn is simply falling. So yeah. So rook b1, a takes b4, knight c6. And he points out that the point of knight c6 is that if white were to play b5, then he would reply knight e5 with the same threat of mate. f4, knight f3 check, king f2, bishop takes c5 check, king takes f3, d4 wins. Okay, I don't think it's really possible to argue that. The knight is being attacked, and of course, we're threatening that. Yeah, I'm sorry for those really thin arrows. This is a little flaw with ChessBase right now with high resolution monitors, and unfortunately, this is what I'm recording with. But I've already been in contact with them, their support, and they told me that this was an issue that was going to be resolved in the next patch. So looking forward to that. Nevertheless, I'll illustrate it with their large squares. The bishop would be going to b7, and with a check would be winning the rook outright. So black has some real problems here. In fact, black doesn't really have anything to do here because, white doesn't have anything to do because the king can't go anywhere. If you go to f2, and obviously e4 and g4 are, whoops, let's get rid of some of these excessively colored squares. If these squares are being covered by the knight, you can go to g2, but that's not going to help anything. And if you were to move back, then the pawn will capture with a check, and you're still going to lose even more material. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. And it's adios muchachos. So rook b8. and bishop a3, protecting it. Now he does point out that if white were to play b5 instead, that would allow bishop takes c5, pawn takes c6, rook takes, knight takes, queen b6 with the strong attack. And obviously he's attacking both the knight, which is hanging, as well as this pawn on f2. I don't think there's a lot to argue, honestly. I was trying to see what would happen if he were to simply play bishop e3. Seems like a logical move, protecting both f2, although he'll still lose a pawn, and the knight. Would this still be sufficient? Um, he can take on e3, like bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. The king can't castle still. There's no obvious safe hold. Or is there? Well, he still has queen d4. Hmm. Okay, so maybe not pawn takes a3. Maybe d4. This is not as straightforward as it looks. Because although the pawn is being attacked twice, I have a rook d8 in there that's going to be painful. For example, bishop takes. Bishop takes. The queen can't take because the knight is hanging. So knight takes. And then you have rook d8. And not only are you attacking it twice, but you're also threatening pawn e5. That looks pretty strong. I think that c pawn is going to fall soon later as well. Okay. Well, I don't know if it's a strong attack, but at least, at the very least, it seems to be good enough to justify playing something different if this indeed is better. Looks pretty balanced to me personally. Bishop d7. And he points out that b5 once again is not possible. Now, the reason why he's bringing up b5 all the time is because this is obviously a key aspect of the position that has to be taken into account every single move, not only by white, but by black as well. Since if suddenly the pawns start advancing gung-ho, it can go bad very, very quickly for black. Black wants to blockade the pawns, not watch them become queens. So in this particular case, instead of castle, which is what was actually played, if he had played b5, knight a5, threatening knight c4, castle, and knight c4 wins a pawn. So plays here, castles, knight a7, rook e1, knight e8. And this time he adds that knight b5, which would be an attractive blockading move, is a little early because after knight takes b5, bishop takes b5, knight d4, attacking, of course, the bishop on b5, the blockader is removed since white also has bishop f1 to follow. And attacking that square. So instead, he prepares an even stronger setup to blockade the pawn. And since the pawn can't move forward anyway, it's perfectly fine. So bishop c1, bishop f6, bishop f4, attacking the rook. e5, bishop d2, d4, knight d5. Okay. Makes more sense than knight e4, simply because after offhand, that I can see if knight e4, the bishop will come back with f5, and the knight doesn't have any obvious squares to go to right now. So something's going to have to be done to allow it to escape. So on knight e4 would be quite vulnerable. So knight d5. Good grief. Sorry. Knight takes f6. And he points out that this is actually second best. And the reason is that even though it seems natural to want to exchange off the knight for the bishop, he would be better off trying to exchange it for a knight instead. So he recommends instead queen b3, and then after knight c7, because black is going to want to try to dislodge that knight. Remember that the knight is also being protected by the bishop on g2. Then knight takes c7, queen takes c7 would have been a better option for him. Okay. So knight takes f6, queen takes f6, bishop takes, queen takes, leaving the knight to be able to come onto b5 as a blockader. f4, f6. And yeah, not taking on f4, of course, because black's idea here is to keep a strong center, keep it intact, and eventually even push e4 forward, e5, e4, at a later date. So f6, queen b3, king h8, rook f1, knight c7, queen c4. I guess it's to prevent. No, it's not to prevent anything. What is it trying to do here? I don't know. Knight b5, rook b e1. The book says this is what move? 28. So this is the end of all white's hopes of advancing his queenside pawns. So he now regroups his pieces for defense against black's center pawns, but unfortunately it is already too late. As you can see, these two pawns here are completely blockaded. They're not going anywhere, ever. And black's pawns, however, are not blockaded and quite mobile. And while they're not moving just yet, it won't be long in the coming. So h6, g4. And the idea is he's intending with g4, he's intending to blockade the central black pawns with knight g3 and e4. So knight here to here to here. That's at least the idea. However, he missed his chance because it was a tactical mistake. Oh, I'm sorry. No, the next move by black is a tactical mistake. He plays rook be8. And black instead could have immediately grabbed the advantage and possibly a winning advantage or more winning with e4 immediately. And the point is that after knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, rook f d8. Obviously threatening the bishop on d2 after the queen moves. So the queen has to stay to protect the bishop on d2. Queen f2, queen d7, and something is going to fall because it's obviously attacking the bishop, but it's also attacking the pawn, and you can't protect both. And this apparently would have been much better for black. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that he made a tactical mistake with rook b8, white returned the favor with f5. Queen d5, king h7, knight g3, e4. Oh yeah, those pawns are going fast. Bishop f4, e3. Oh boy. Wow, that's looking just terrible. I can't believe he didn't resign already. I'm a firm believer in you can't save a game by resigning, but wow, this is brutal. Queen d1, queen c4, h4, knight d5, g5, d3. Yeah, g5 looks strong and threatening and whatnot against the king, but you have to realize is that that's all it is. It looks threatening because in spite of the fact that it looks like it might blow up the position around the king, the pieces can't get to him. He doesn't have to come and attack anything. He doesn't have to open himself up. He can bring his own rook on g8, and white doesn't really have that option here. So unfortunately, it's going to have to be queen g4, rook g8, obviously with the idea if you decide to take on h6 or f6, yeah, you're opening yourself up to your own counterattack. So knight h5, rook e4. So here Pachman makes the interesting comment that it's interesting to compare this to the board position at move 13. While white's passed pawns on the queen side haven't moved a single square, black's passed pawns are ready to win the game. And let's take a quick look at move 13 so we can make that comparison ourselves visually. So this is the position after move 13, knight c6. And as we can see, the pawns are here on b4 and c5. And of course, the black pawns are obviously just starting their long journey on d5 and e6. They haven't done anything. But these are the pawns that seemingly are free to advance and cause trouble. And if we move this position now 25 moves later, this is actually move 38, rook e4, we can see that those very same pawns on b4 and c5 are exactly where they were. They haven't moved anywhere. This is not a result of fancy exchanges. This is those very same pawns. And whereas black's pawns, which used to be on d5 and e6, and yeah, obviously I'm not clicking on those pawns, have now advanced to e3 and d3, and of course are completely crushing. So as a result, after g6 check, and this is just a desperado move, we have king h8, and he concludes this game with the following comments, and I'll share that with you. He says, let me dig it up here. Okay, it says, so now that it's over, we can see that both sides have connected passed pawns or a pawn majority on both sides of the boards. The most important fact is not a matter of having passed pawns, but the mobility of those very same pawns. And this is essentially what is going to decide whether or not those passed pawns are an advantage or not. So, brilliantly chosen example by Ludek Pachman. And that concludes the chapter on blockaded pawns or even special passed pawns. And the next chapter we're going to be going on to is the isolated pawn, chapter 4 in his eminent book. So this is the opening of the chapter on the isolated pawn, chapter 4, and I'll read to you the introduction. Every player has often found how troublesome a pawn can be when it is separated from the other pawns and it cannot be supported by any of them. A pawn is thus termed the isolated pawn, since it's lost its simplest and most economical protection of another pawn, and it is therefore clearly vulnerable. Even if it is not captured, the defending pieces have to be passively tied down to guarding it, while the more active attacking pieces obtain an advantage elsewhere. The following game illustrates the indirect exploitation of the weakness of an isolated pawn. This is a game played between Zita and Pachman himself, and it's taken from the Czech Championship of 1954. The book calls it Czechoslovak Championship, but of course, country names and borders change over time. We'll skip through the opening, and his first real comments take place at move 13. So, a second, and there we go. So Pachman is playing black, and this is the bird's opening. Larsen also has a variation of this. It's called the Larsen bird opening, which includes f4 and b3, a topic for another time. bd2, bishop b7, knight d6, e5. Huh. Well, regardless of isolated pawns or not, it has to be said that black has not been shy about taking advantage of the rather ponderous play by white and has grabbed an enormous amount of space. Sometimes this can be risky. It doesn't seem to be the case here because I can't really see some kind of hidden explosion happening with the bishops on c1 and d1, as you can see. Yeah. Anyway, on to the topic at hand. And knight takes e4. Now he points out here that white cannot play knight g5, with the idea, of course, of the double attack on e6, attacking both the queen and the rook, and therefore being able to take back with the knight, since presumably black would be forced to protect it. But it doesn't work, because black can simply ignore this with e takes d3. Yep, leaving that knight e6, and it will happen. Knight e6, queen c6, obviously threatening mate on g2 with that queen and bishop battery. And if bishop f3, obviously protecting since there's really nothing else, rook takes f3 is crushing. Knight d8, trying to put in some small, let's say, complications in the middle. And black has the magnificent Zwischenzug, or an intermediary move, rook e3. And yes, the rook is hanging, but if you take that rook, then you're going to get mated on g2, as mentioned before. So you wouldn't have any option. You'd be forced to take the queen because you have to stop that mate. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to do you any good if you're mated. So knight takes c6, rook takes c1. You have to take back the rook because it's the most valuable piece. And knight takes c6, and black has a huge material advantage. For example, if you take on d3, you're stuck with 5 pawns to 6, and you're looking at 2 pieces for that rook. Ouch. So yeah. Well analyzed, but of course this was Pachman's own game, so it's not a surprise that he had analyzed this so thoroughly. And in 1954, I think he was at his peak pretty much. So knight takes c4, d takes c4, and here he adds the further comment. Okay, so both sides have an isolated e-pawn, but close study reveals that white's pawn is much the weaker of the two. And the reason for this is that black's pieces are placed most favorably both for defending his own king pawn, using the queen as well as the bishop on g7. So the pawn, obviously, on e5 is very well protected, and there's not a lot of ways to attack it other than this knight for the moment. And also for attacking his opponent's king pawn, using his own bishop on b7, as well as the maneuver of knight to d2 to d7, and then f6, and then from there it would be attacking this pawn twice, among others. So White's pieces, therefore, in contrast, are far less effective. For example, if he tries to develop his queen's bishop aggressively with b3 and bishop b2, I'll just show this here, with the bishop here, his king, oh, good grief, I hate descriptive notation. No, his f4 square, because now the bishop would be gone, it would be playing over here, would become an ideal outpost for black's rook, and therefore attacking the pawn again. Okay. Seems pretty simple enough. Black's plan now is to prevent the regrouping of the enemy pieces and to tie his opponent down to the defense of his own e4 pawn. So h6 and knight d2. Now he adds here that another option, possibly better for white, would have been bishop e2. And the obvious tactical idea here is that if bishop takes bishop c4 check, and suddenly this bishop is hanging. So he proposes c4. And now white would play queen b4, attacking the pawn twice. And after bishop e4, queen takes c4, queen takes c4, queen takes c4, bishop takes c4, king h7, he'd be worse, but not so much worse. I don't know. The queen side looks the king side looks pretty vulnerable. Yeah, you can grab the pawn. It seems like a lot of effort for a second class pawn. C for e. What about queen h4? Attacking, of course, h6 with the bishop and the queen. Now you can't, as far as I can tell, you can't play g5 because then you have bishop takes g5. Pawn takes, knight takes, and yowzer. And these pieces are kind of far away from the king, right? If you exchange off the rook, then you're going to be even one more piece down. I don't think this works either, because if you were to try something like this to protect h7 with the queen, guess what happens? Oopsie daisy. So not g5, maybe h5. I still think you're looking for trouble here, man. Bishop e3? I don't know. No, not knight c6. Knight d7? G4. like I said, it's the kind of player I am. I tend to do a lot of attacking and tactics and stuff. I don't know if this is the best, but this is the way I would be directing it. I wouldn't be worried about sitting there playing gung ho to recapture that c4 pawn, which looks completely useless. Well, whatever. Anyway, so d takes c4. So yeah, it takes knight d2, knight d7, rook takes, bishop f3, knight f6. This goes without commentary in the book. Knight f1, queen f7. I preload these PGNs into ChessBase, and I put in a little, let's say, note. In the notation, it just says book, so that I know that at that particular move, the book has something to say, and then I Alt-Tab and go to the PDF. This is a PDF. I have the books in French in large paperbacks, so it's a nuisance to have them open here on the table and whatever, so it's easier this way. And just read the comments to you. So 21. Okay, so he's basically saying that with this, he is threatening. Yeah, okay, no surprise. He's threatening to take on e4 because the knight on f1 is hanging. So obviously, if we're black to move, then black would simply play knight takes e4. And sure, the bishop can take, bishop takes, queen takes, and queen takes f1 mate. So knight g3, queen c4, further attacking that pawn. Now c2, and also, of course, attacking e4 one more time. Not that it's vulnerable, but it can be. Queen goes to c3. So with his last moves, black has succeeded in positioning all of his pieces effectively. And after the passive c3, instead of queen c3, rook d8, white would soon be embarrassed for good moves. So Zeta, white, decided to exchange queens, hoping that piece play will compensate for the weakness of his pawns. So queen c3, pawn takes c3. And yes, the structure looks dreadful, but h5. And that's threatening to win a pawn, obviously, since h4 will get rid of the knight, and suddenly there will be only one piece protecting e4 once the knight leaves. So bishop g5, threatening to remove one of those attacking pieces. Knight h7. Obviously, not interested in this. Bishop e3. Bishop f6. Rook d1. Bishop g5. Wow. Okay. So an executive decision basically saying, look, my knight is worth more than that bishop, but I'll gladly exchange my bishop for that bishop if you want. And of course, since the object of the game here is that pawn on e4, at least for the moment, it goes without saying that the bishop, the black squared bishop, is of little interest in that particular plan. It can never attack e4 after all. So bishop takes g5. Knight takes g5, rook d7, rook f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7. And of course, the threat continues to be h4, getting rid of the knight, and therefore winning that e4 pawn. h4. So white decides to take matters in his own hands. Knight takes f3, check, exclamation point. Okay. And here he says, this move is only possible because white has played h4, which will later allow black to create an outside passed pawn with g5. So illustrating it here, obviously not immediately because the knight, of course, is attacking h5. But once the knight is gone, if you presume that knight is no longer existing here, is no longer here, then after g4, g5, the h-pawn, this h-pawn will be forced to do something, either take or just let himself be captured. And this h-pawn will then be free to move forward. Okay. Even though it's not about isolated pawns per se, it's something certainly to remember. Bishop c8. And Pachman adds that while the rest belongs to the endgame, it's still nonetheless not an uninteresting endgame. So king f2, I'll just go through the moves. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. H takes g5, king g6. There's obviously no way to protect it. Bishop e6, a3, king takes g5, knight e3, bishop a2. Okay. c4, h4, king g4, king f4. Yeah, he's not going to take on c4 and leave his e-pawn attacked. Knight e3, h3, a4, king g5, knight g4, king f4, knight e3, bishop b1. And black won. White resigned. So he adds that the isolated pawn in the example of the game was not an open file. It was not on an open file, so it wasn't possible to attack it from the front with the major pieces. Okay, he had a pawn placed in front of it actually. But isolated doesn't mean that there's a square in front, even though it's usually the case. It means that the pawn doesn't have anyone holding it from either side to help protect it. We deliberately chose the untypical example as our first illustration of the isolated pawn because many books, so Pachman is critical of these many books, it seems obvious, only deal with the isolated pawns on an open file. Fair enough. Clearly, an isolated pawn is just as much of a weakness, even if it cannot be attacked from the front by the heavy pieces, as the previous game illustrated. Of course, as our next game will show, an open line greatly helps us to exploit the weakness of an isolated pawn. And the next game is between Sokolsky and Simagin from the first Soviet Correspondence Championship. Nice. So this game is between two Soviet players of the 40s and 50s, essentially. Alexei Sokolsky versus Vladimir Simagin. And as you can see by the info, this is actually the first Soviet Correspondence Chess Championship, an event that the first player, playing white, Alexei Sokolsky, actually won. He was considered an over-the-board international master of international master strength because the title didn't exist quite then, and actually won the Ukrainian championship, if I understood it, twice. Did so in some of the major over-the-board events, but of course was a noted theoretician as well as correspondence player. For those who know a little bit more about the names of openings, you may recognize the name of Sokolsky. Indeed, he was the one who investigated in great depth the opening move, and I'll show it to you here, but that's not the basis of this game, b4. And yes, That opening is called the Sokolsky opening, not because he's the first person to ever play, let's say, b4, but he is the first person to have played it consistently and investigated and elaborated the theory on it in great depth. So if you ever run across b4, feel like playing it, know that this is Sokolsky, the author of this particular game. So let's take a look at the game here. Now, this is, of course, based on the isolated pawn, and let's see what happens. I will just tell you a spoiler alert. White Sokolsky does win. So the opening goes uncommented for the most part, and that's appropriate. So we have Fianchetto Grunfeld. And this move comes with a question mark by Ludek Pachman, deservedly so. He notes that for some reason, Black has decided to lock in his strong bishop. Indeed, before e5, as you can see, we have the g7 pawn exerting enormous amount of power on that long diagonal all the way down to the rook on a1. And for reasons unknown, because there's really nothing to explain it, Black has decided to make his good bishop a bad bishop with e5. Not the greatest move. Obviously, they didn't have computers because a computer would have dinged this immediately nowadays. But that being said, it was played, and Pachman correctly brings it up. So bishop e3, rook fc1, bishop e6, bishop f1, queen b7, knight a4, knight takes, b takes. Now there is a little tactical line, and Pachman, by the way, is quick to point out that a lot of his, let's say, tactical notes on the main variations and whatnot are actually taken from Sokolsky himself, who wrote about these games and shared his analysis. So, unlike, let's say, previous games where Ludek Pachman often was forced to try to find and elucidate the reasons behind the moves on his own, completely justifiably, here he had the benefit of being able to draw upon the comments and annotations by Sokolsky, who, as I will reiterate, won this actual tournament. So nevertheless, he does point out that queen takes c6, which was a tactical idea. Yes, he just took the knight on a4, but after queen takes c6, rook takes c6, now you have basically three pieces hanging. So one of them is going to come back to white. We have bishop takes b3, bishop takes a6, and it's fine for white, but it's just not as strong as the move played in the game, which was b takes a4. Now, of course, here we're looking at an isolated pawn on the c file. Knight takes b8, and he points out not c5, sorry, not c5, because of rook ab1, and of course not bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, queen takes c5, queen takes c4, after which black is actually a little bit better. Because, of course, you've given up that weak black isolated pawn for the very strong e4 pawn. So, yeah. So instead, he should have, had he played, let's say, c5 instead of knight b8, rook ab1, queen c6, queen d3, bishop c8, queen takes b3 check, king h8, bishop b5, queen c7, queen c4. And this would be very much to white's liking. Black instead played knight b8, which admittedly doesn't look great anyway. I mean, what? Rook ab1, queen c7, knight d2, rook c8, a5, knight d7, bishop a6, queen takes a5. And here, Pachman makes the following comment. So black here offers the exchange, hoping to alleviate some of his woes in this particular position. But unfortunately, it's to no avail, and it doesn't really relieve him of much. And of course, we're looking at a position where black is completely strangled. On top of that isolated pawn, he's trying to hold it down. And yeah, he hasn't managed to do anything and doesn't really have any constructive, let's say, positive plans to move forward, at least not for now. So queen takes a5, bishop takes rook, rook takes bishop, rook b7, c5. So finally getting that pawn moving a little bit forward, but yeah. Queen d3, attacking the knight twice with both rook and bishop. Simple chess, as Michael Steen once wrote in a very famous book. Queen a4, a book that I know about, but I never actually read. Queen d6, rook c6, queen e7. Yeah. So now we already can see that black's pieces are starting to really infiltrate. Of course, you have to wonder if that queen is very safe there, but since this is correspondence chess, it's safe to say that white had plenty of time to analyze all of the consequences here. Bishop f8, queen e8, and he resigned. And he resigned in view of the following two lines. The first is, obviously the knight is being attacked twice. The first is if rook d6, which is pretty simple, then bishop h6, even simpler, wins the game. The bishop is attacked twice, and after rook takes d7, we're looking at mate. So the second line is actually kind of pretty. After rook b6, trying to force the exchange here, rook takes b6, bishop f7, nice Zwischenzug, and if you want to pause the video to try to find the move by white, it's kind of nice. He has his own Zwischenzug, rook a6. That's a stellar winning move. And obviously, after queen takes a6, queen takes d7, and we're up a rook. And if bishop takes e8's queen, then rook takes queen back, and same situation, we're up a rook. So as a result, he resigned. And our dear, sorry, I'm pulling up the notes here on the PDF here, points out that, so the reader may well have the impression from all this and the previous games, that the isolated pawn must constitute a weakness in all circumstances. But matters aren't so simple. Of course, the isolated pawn is almost always a serious disadvantage in the endgame. But in the middle game, it can become even a vital attacking factor. For convenience, we will deal only with the isolated queen pawn, d pawn, which is a good example of the contrast between the static weakness and dynamic strength. On a very quick side note, I will point out that I believe it's Baburin. I could be wrong. I think it was the Scottish grandmaster or adopted grandmaster Baburin, who wrote a book called Winning Pawn Structures. And the title might seem to suggest it talks about all kinds of winning pawn structures, but actually it covered only the isolated d pawn from both ends. Anyway, so we meet the isolated queen pawn in many openings, especially in countless variations of the queen's gambit, where it can even be brought about deliberately. So this is the opening dealing with the first sample highlighted by Ludek Pachman. d4, d5, c4, d takes c4. I'll go right through it because he wants to show the actual position that results from this. And here, of course, we have our first example of the isolated pawn. It's actually a very classic and standard example. And he comments the following. So this is one of the variations in which we have an isolated pawn on d4, which can be differentiated depending on whether the opposing C or E pawn has disappeared in the process. If I hesitate when I read this, it's not because I am stuttering on the text. It's because I'm kind of translating the descriptive notation that he uses in the text with the algebraic that I'm trying to share because that's the one that everybody's familiar with. The last quoted sequence of moves gives us an example of the first type, which is, of course, with the E pawn advanced on E6 and there's no C pawn. And here's an example of the second type, in which it's the opposite, in which the E pawn is gone and the C pawn is still on the board. So again, we have d4, d5. And here we have a different line entirely. And we can move forward. Again, this is just an illustrative example to show the kind of position that you can encounter in certain openings. And here, of course, we can see that there is no E pawn, but there is a C pawn. Strategically, this means, of course, because of the way you're castled, where your pieces go, and whatever, that the plans around the D pawn may be similar, but there will be, of course, key differences as well. So let us return to the first type. And he brings up the pawn structure. Give me just a second. So this is the pawn structure that he wants to discuss, and he has some elaborate explanations, which I will then put in a text so that you can see this in a simpler format, not just me reading from the book. But he notes the following. Such a pawn structure is unfavorable in the endgame for the side with the isolated pawn, and this weakness can often lead to a loss. The situation is much more complex in the middle game, where the dynamic strength of the pawn can, under certain circumstances, come into effect. With well-placed pieces, the side with the pawn can carry out the advance d5, d4, d5, often involving the sacrifice of this pawn. In addition, the pawn supports good outposts for the knight on e5 if black drives it away, for example, e5. And if black drives it away with, let's say, f7, f6, then the e6 pawn will suddenly become a weakness. Likewise, white has the opportunity of trying to exploit the weakness here on c5 and putting pieces of his own there as well. If, again, black were to try to chase it away with, say, b6 for some reason, then we're looking at weaknesses on c6 to put your pieces just as well. It may not be covered by that pawn on d4, but it's a gap. By exploiting the e5 square, white can often carry out a successful kingside attack. In general, we can say that given the pawn structure, both sides should plan their play according to the following principles. White should avoid too many simplifications. 2. Post the pieces in such a way that d5 is possible at a well-timed moment, or that black's pieces are tied to preventing this move. Meaning that black, even though you can't necessarily push d5, black is forced to tie down his pieces trying to prevent you from making that kind of break. And then either occupy e5 with a knight and attack on the king side, or operate on the c file using c5 as a strong point. On the flip side, black should be striving for simplifications and a transition to the endgame, just as white should be avoiding it, at least as long as he has that isolated pawn to deal with. 2. Should prevent the advance of the d-pawn by occupying the blockading square of d5 with either a knight or, at the very worst, a bishop. And number 3, tie down white's pieces to the defense of that isolated pawn by playing, for example, knight to c6 and bishop to f6, both attacking the pawn on d4. And that will wrap up the lesson of this particular video. In the next one, we will continue with Szabo versus setters and further our studies and understandings of the isolated pawn. Thank you for joining me, and see you soon.